Time for Canada and China to put aside their, and he characterized them as normal differences, and foster practical cooperation moving forward.
In a bold and unexpected twist on the global stage, China has announced a staggering $330 billion economic support package for Canada, leaving both economists and politicians stunned. What's more surprising is the reaction from former U.S. President Donald Trump, who reportedly called the move a strategic betrayal. As China deepens its influence in the West and Canada pivots away from traditional American financial support, geopolitical dynamics are shifting in real time. How did this alliance come about? What does it mean for North America? And why is Trump so furious? Let's break it all down in this explosive deep dive into the deal that could redefine global power. How the $330 billion rescue came to be. The origins of China's staggering $330 billion financial rescue of Canada lie in a unique convergence of opportunity, strategy, and desperation. Over the past 5 years, Canada has struggled with sluggish GDP growth, growing public debt, and increasing strain on social services, following several rounds of economic disruption, from global supply chain issues to natural resource downturns. The COVID-19 pandemic only worsened matters, leaving provinces like Alberta and British Columbia seeking external funding to boost energy production, stabilize housing markets, and fund infrastructure development. With U.S. support largely limited or politically fraught, especially during and after the Trump administration, Canada began quietly exploring alternative financing routes. That's where China stepped in. Beijing saw an opportunity not just to gain economic influence in a G7 nation, but also to undermine American hegemony in its own backyard. Canadian officials, under pressure to find solutions that didn't involve IMF-like austerity measures, were receptive. After more than a year of secret negotiations, a comprehensive financing and trade agreement was signed. China pledged $330 billion in a mix of direct investment, low-interest loans, and strategic partnerships, particularly in sectors like green energy, rare earth minerals, AI technology, and rail infrastructure. In exchange, China received unprecedented access to Canadian markets and resource extraction licenses, along with co-ownership stakes in several strategic infrastructure projects. The deal was made public with cautious optimism in Canada, but shocked the global financial world, especially the United States. It marked a major success for China's Belt and Road Initiative, now firmly rooted in North America, and signaled a tectonic shift in the balance of global influence. Trump's outrage and the U.S. backlash. Former President Donald Trump, never one to remain silent on global affairs that touch U.S. interests, reacted to the China-Canada deal with fiery condemnation. In a Truth Social post that quickly went viral, he called the agreement a national disgrace and accused Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau of betraying Western values in favor of authoritarian cash. Trump's outrage wasn't just performative. It stemmed from a deep concern that China was achieving what he had long tried to prevent, gaining a foothold in North America through economic colonization. According to insiders from the Trump camp, the former president believes this move by China directly threatens U.S. dominance and exposes weaknesses in American foreign and trade policy. During his term, Trump focused on renegotiating NAFTA into USMCA and placing tariffs on Chinese goods, all aimed at containing Beijing's global ambitions. But with one massive check, China had suddenly leapfrogged decades of trade maneuvering and positioned itself as a financial savior to a U.S. ally. Conservative media echoed Trump's sentiments, calling for immediate investigations into the Canadian government's dealings and demanding retaliatory measures, including sanctions and suspension of certain bilateral trade agreements. Meanwhile, Trump's supporters began framing the deal as a Trojan horse for Chinese surveillance and cyber espionage. Some GOP lawmakers introduced emergency proposals to limit Canadian access to U.S. defense contracts, claiming national security concerns. However, not all U.S. responses were reactive. A faction of American economists and diplomats called for a calm, calculated response, noting that Canada's pivot might have been a reaction to years of neglect and unpredictability in U.S. diplomacy. Nevertheless, the prevailing mood in the Trump-aligned faction of the Republican Party was one of betrayal and fury, a mood Trump is likely to exploit as he campaigns once again, using the China-Canada alliance as a cautionary tale of failed American leadership and the risks of weakening alliances. Canada's gamble, economic boon or sovereignty risk. From Canada's perspective, the $330 billion deal with China is a high-stakes gamble that could define its economy for generations. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau defended the agreement as a pragmatic decision rooted in economic necessity, emphasizing that the deal would help lift key industries, create hundreds of thousands of jobs, and supercharge green innovation. But not everyone is convinced. Political opponents, academics, and civil society groups have raised alarms about what this level of foreign financial entanglement might mean for Canadian sovereignty. The agreement gives China partial control over major infrastructure projects, access to energy pipelines, and even long-term contracts on rare earth mineral extraction, resources critical to both economic independence and national security. Critics argue that Canada may have exchanged short-term liquidity for long-term vulnerability, effectively tying itself to a foreign power with a history of leveraging economic relationships for political influence. Concerns also abound over data privacy and technology transfers, as Chinese firms will be partnering with Canadian companies in areas like 5G, artificial intelligence, and healthcare infrastructure. Indigenous groups and environmental advocates have also expressed fear that China-backed resource projects could lead to weakened environmental protections and encroachment on protected lands. In Parliament, the opposition has demanded full transparency on the deal's terms, urging the government to disclose how decisions were made and what oversight mechanisms exist. While Trudeau insists that Canada remains firmly in control, trust is eroding among a segment of the population worried that the nation's future is being shaped not in Ottawa, but in Beijing. The gamble is clear. If the deal delivers economic revitalization without compromising democratic values or national autonomy, Trudeau may emerge as a visionary. But if China's influence grows unchecked, Canada could find itself economically bound to a superpower with very different values and few exit options. Global impact: China's strategic victory. This unprecedented financial partnership between China and Canada is more than just a bilateral agreement. It's a strategic masterstroke in Beijing's long-term geopolitical playbook. For years, China has pursued global influence through its Belt and Road Initiative, investing billions in infrastructure across Asia, Africa, and Europe. But North America has largely remained outside of its reach until now. With this $330 billion injection into Canada, China has secured more than economic access. It has symbolically breached a Western stronghold, weakening the traditional U.S.-led economic bloc. The implications are massive. First, China now has a direct line into North American markets and resources, and more importantly, a public relations victory that can be leveraged worldwide. Beijing can now point to Canada as proof that even the West is willing to embrace Chinese capital in times of need. This boosts China's credibility as a global lender and increases its soft power in international institutions. Second, the move may prompt other countries, especially those weary of IMF and World Bank conditions, to consider Beijing-backed alternatives for development aid and economic stimulus. China's state-controlled media has already begun broadcasting the success of the Canada deal as a model for 21st century cooperation. For the United States, this is deeply concerning. It shows that China doesn't need military might to challenge American dominance. It can do so quietly, with money and influence. And perhaps most critically, this reshapes the narrative of global dependence. For decades, developing nations turned to the US or European financial institutions in times of need. Now, even a G7 country is turning to Beijing. This could accelerate a realignment in the global power structure, tilting more influence toward China while isolating the US diplomatically. Unless countered with a unified Western economic strategy, this move could be the beginning of a new global order where China, not the US, sits at the financial helm. Media frenzy and public opinion across borders. The announcement of China's $330 billion rescue package for Canada unleashed a media storm that highlighted the starkly different narratives in North America. In the United States, particularly within conservative outlets aligned with Trump's worldview, the deal was framed as a geopolitical disaster. Commentators portrayed it as Canada turning its back on its closest ally and succumbing to Chinese influence, casting Trudeau's government as naive or even complicit in undermining Western unity. Headlines spoke of a betrayal, economic capitulation, and loss of North America. Social media amplified these sentiments, with viral clips of Trump's sharp enunciations fueling debates. Conversely, much of the Canadian media presented a more measured, if cautious, perspective. Major outlets such as CBC and the Globe and Mail emphasized the economic urgency that precipitated the deal, highlighting Canada's need to diversify financial partnerships amidst a fracturing global order. However, public opinion polls in Canada revealed a nation divided. While some Canadians welcomed the promise of economic stimulus, job creation, and infrastructure modernization, others worried about the potential erosion of sovereignty and national security. Indigenous leaders and environmental groups voiced skepticism and concern, fearing the deal could exacerbate social inequities and environmental degradation. In China, state media lauded the agreement as a win-win partnership and a milestone in China's peaceful rise, using the event to bolster national pride and international prestige. The narrative promoted was one of China stepping in as a benevolent superpower ready to help even the wealthiest nations in times of need, contrasting it with what they portrayed as American economic protectionism and decline. Overall, the media frenzy has underscored how this deal is about far more than economics. It's a cultural and political flashpoint, shaping identities and alliances in a deeply polarized world. How Canadians, Americans, and Chinese perceive this event will influence diplomatic and economic policies for years to come. Long-term consequences and the road ahead. Looking forward, the long-term consequences of China's massive $330 billion investment in Canada remain uncertain but potentially transformative. For Canada, the challenge will be balancing economic benefits with national sovereignty and democratic principles. The deal's success depends on the government's ability to maintain transparency, enforce strong regulatory oversight, and safeguard critical infrastructure from undue foreign control. Failure to do so could lead to increased political turmoil domestically, weakening Canada's global standing and inviting backlash from allies. For China, this strategic foothold offers leverage not only economically but politically, enabling Beijing to influence policies in North America subtly. If China can successfully demonstrate that it can prop up Western economies without overt coercion, it may reshape global governance structures to better align with its vision, one less centered on liberal democracy and more on pragmatic economic influence. For the United States, the challenge is daunting. Trump's harsh rhetoric reflects a broader anxiety about America's waning influence, but the solution requires more than blame. Washington must reconsider its trade and foreign policy strategies, possibly embracing more cooperative, multilateral approaches to compete with China effectively. Moreover, the U.S. may need to rebuild trust with allies by offering more predictable and constructive economic partnerships. Globally, this deal may mark the beginning of a more fragmented and multipolar economic world order. Other countries may look to diversify their alliances, reducing reliance on any single power. International institutions may also face pressure to adapt, as China's growing role challenges traditional governance models. In the end, China's rescue of Canada isn't just a financial transaction. It's a powerful symbol of changing times, a reminder that global power is shifting and nations must navigate this new landscape carefully to protect their interests and values. Economic analysts weigh in, risks and rewards. Economic experts worldwide have been closely analyzing the implications of China's massive $330 billion investment in Canada, and opinions are mixed, highlighting the complexity of this unprecedented deal. On one hand, many analysts acknowledge the immediate benefits. Canada gains access to substantial capital that can help modernize its aging infrastructure, stimulate innovation, and diversify its economy beyond traditional reliance on the United States. The infusion could accelerate Canada's green energy transition by funding projects in solar, wind, and electric vehicle technology, areas where China already leads globally. Furthermore, this investment provides Canadian industries with access to Chinese markets, potentially boosting exports and creating jobs amid a period of economic uncertainty. On the other hand, the long-term risks are significant. Some economists warn that deep financial dependency on China could expose Canada to vulnerabilities if political tensions escalate. Given China's track record of using economic leverage for political purposes, Canada risks becoming entangled in Beijing's broader strategic objectives, potentially compromising its autonomy in critical policy decisions. There's also concern about the debt trap phenomenon, where countries struggle to repay large loans and are forced to cede control over key assets. Furthermore, some analysts worry about the implications for Canada's trade relations with the U.S. and other Western allies. If Canada's economic policies become closely aligned with China, it could strain these relationships and disrupt existing trade agreements. The complexity of managing competing interests between Washington and Beijing places Canadian policymakers in a delicate position, balancing economic growth against diplomatic fallout. Ultimately, this deal could either position Canada as a pioneering global player embracing multipolarity, or leave it caught between superpowers in a geopolitical tug-of-war. Security concerns and technological implications. Beyond economics, the security and technological ramifications of China's investment in Canada have become hot-button issues. The agreement includes significant partnerships in high-tech sectors such as 5G telecommunications, artificial intelligence, and data infrastructure, fields critical to national security and future competitiveness. Canadian security agencies have expressed concerns about allowing Chinese firms access to sensitive networks and data systems, citing risks of espionage and cyber intrusion. Given China's documented cyber capabilities and past incidents of intellectual property theft, critics warn that the deal could enable Beijing to gain unprecedented insight into Canadian governmental and corporate operations. Moreover, there is unease about Chinese involvement in critical infrastructure projects like ports, railways, and energy grids. Control over these assets could provide China with strategic leverage in times of diplomatic conflict, including the potential to disrupt supply chains or exert pressure on Canada through economic means. The Canadian government has pledged strict regulatory oversight and national security reviews of all Chinese investments, but skeptics argue these measures may be insufficient given the scale and complexity of the agreement. In the realm of technology, the deal also raises questions about data sovereignty and privacy protections. Chinese tech firms often operate under legal frameworks that require cooperation with government intelligence agencies, creating fears that Canadian citizen data could be accessed or misused. These concerns have led to calls from opposition parties and advocacy groups for greater transparency and for limiting Chinese participation in sensitive sectors. The debate underscores the broader dilemma faced by democracies when engaging economically with authoritarian regimes that may exploit technological partnerships for geopolitical gain. Impacts on U.S.-Canada relations and North American unity. The China-Canada deal has undeniably strained the historically close relationship between the U.S. and Canada, raising questions about the future of North American unity. For decades, Canada and the U.S. have collaborated closely on trade, security, and diplomatic initiatives, with shared values underpinning this partnership. However, the scale and nature of China's financial involvement in Canada represent a divergence in strategic priorities that complicate this alliance. From Washington's perspective, Canada's willingness to accept such a large investment from China could be seen as undermining efforts to maintain a united front against Beijing's global ambitions. The U.S. government has privately expressed concerns that Canada may become less reliable as an economic and security partner, particularly if Beijing's influence grows in critical sectors. This worry is intensified by recent geopolitical tensions, including disputes over Taiwan, cybersecurity threats, and human rights issues. In response, the U.S. may seek to recalibrate its policies toward Canada, potentially increasing economic incentives, revisiting trade agreements, or enhancing cooperation on security matters to discourage further Chinese encroachment. Conversely, Canada may try to balance its new economic ties with China against maintaining strong relations with its southern neighbor, walking a diplomatic tightrope. The outcome of this dynamic will have broader implications for North America's collective ability to respond to global challenges. If Canada and the U.S. drift apart, it could weaken the region's influence in international forums and embolden adversaries. Alternatively, it might spur renewed dialogue and collaboration aimed at forging a more flexible, inclusive alliance that can navigate the complexities of the 21st century. In any case, the China-Canada rescue deal has redefined the contours of North American relations and will continue to be a focal point of geopolitical strategy. China's unprecedented $330 billion rescue of Canada has shaken the world, stunned Trump, and opened a new chapter in global geopolitics. Whether this bold move will be a masterstroke or a misstep remains to be seen.